What if I told you that one of the most famous radio messages in Formula One came from a moment when the championship was already slipping away, and that the few words spoken over that radio would become almost as famous as the final lap itself? Because what happened in Abu Dhabi in 2021 wasn't simply about one overtake, one decision, or even one championship. It was about what Formula One believed the sport was supposed to be. And when I look back at that final lap, one question keeps coming back. How did a single decision create such a lasting divide between Mercedes supporters, Red Bull supporters, and fans who had watched Formula One for decades? I want to take you back to the exact sequence of events, because the real story becomes much more complicated when you look beyond that famous radio message. And the closer I look at it, the more I understand why this moment still generates debate years later. Before I get into the final lap, I want to ask you to subscribe if you enjoy detailed Formula One stories that go beyond the headlines. Because this story isn't just about who won in Abu Dhabi. It's about why the events of that night changed the way Formula One was managed afterward. I think the easiest mistake is to start with the final corner or the final overtake, but the tension had been building for almost the entire season. By the time the championship reached the Yas Marina circuit, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen were tied on points. That alone was extraordinary. After an entire season of racing, there was almost nothing separating them in the standings. The title was effectively coming down to one final race. And Hamilton appeared to have everything under control. From the opening lap, he took the lead and began establishing control over the race. Mercedes had chosen a strategy built around maintaining track position, and for much of the afternoon, that decision looked completely reasonable. Hamilton was running on hard tires that were becoming increasingly worn, but he had something incredibly valuable: clean air and the comfortable advantage over Verstappen. For lap after lap, the situation seemed to favor Mercedes. Then came lap 53. Nicholas Latifi's Williams Saris went into the barriers, and suddenly the entire race changed. The safety car was deployed, and immediately the strategic calculations became completely different. Red Bull had very little to lose, so Verstappen came into the pits for a fresh set of soft tires. Mercedes faced a completely different choice. Hamilton was leading, but if he stopped, he would surrender track position. If he stayed out, he would have to restart the race on older, hard tires. Mercedes chose to stay out. At that moment, it still looked as though the decision might work. But there was another problem. Between Hamilton and Verstappen were 5 lapped cars. Under the normal safety car procedure, lapped cars can be allowed to pass the cars on the lead lap and return to the back of the field before racing resumes. But there wasn't much time left. With only a handful of laps remaining, allowing the entire group to unlap itself created the possibility that the race would finish behind the safety car. And if that happened, Hamilton would become champion. Initially, race control communicated that the lapped cars would not be allowed to pass. That should have been the end of the discussion, except it wasn't. The pressure was enormous. Red Bull wanted the race to resume. Mercedes wanted the procedure to be followed. The teams were communicating directly with race control, and Michael Masi was at the center of a situation that had become almost impossible to manage calmly. Then, on lap 57, came the decision that changed everything. Masi instructed the 5 lapped cars between Hamilton and Verstappen to pass the safety car. Those 5 cars were Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon, Charles Leclerc, and Sebastian Vettel. The cars further down the field were not given the same instruction. That distinction became one of the most important details of the entire controversy. Suddenly, the 5 cars separating the 2 championship contenders were gone. Hamilton was still leading, Verstappen was directly behind him, and Verstappen had brand new soft tires. Hamilton had heavily used hard tires. There was 1 lap remaining. When I think about that moment, this is where the entire race changes emotionally. Until then, the championship had been a long strategic battle. Now it had become a 1-lap confrontation between 2 drivers who had spent the entire season fighting for the same prize. Mercedes knew exactly what was coming, and that's when Toto Wolff's radio message became part of Formula One history. Wolff communicated directly with race control, and his voice captured the disbelief inside the garage. "No, Michael, no, Michael, that was so not right." Those words were broadcast around the world, and almost immediately they became symbolic. For Mercedes supporters, the message represented a team principal watching the rules being applied in a way he believed was fundamentally unfair. For Red Bull supporters, it represented something completely different. To them, it sounded like the losing side trying to influence the outcome after a dramatic change in circumstances. And then came Masi's response. "Toto, it's called a motor race, okay? We went car racing." That exchange became one of the defining moments of the entire controversy. But here's where I think the story gets interesting, because the argument wasn't really about whether Formula One should have racing. Of course it should. The real argument was whether the procedure used to restart the race was consistent with the sporting regulations. That distinction matters. There were people who believed the race should finish under green conditions whenever possible. There were others who believed the regulations existed precisely to prevent officials from making special decisions under extraordinary pressure. And both sides believed they were defending the integrity of the sport.
Of Formula One. That's why this controversy became so difficult to resolve. Mercedes supporters pointed toward the wording of the regulations surrounding lapped cars. Their argument was that if lapped cars were going to be allowed to pass, the normal procedure should apply to all eligible cars, rather than selectively clearing only the 5 vehicles positioned between Hamilton and Verstappen. From that perspective, the issue wasn't simply that Verstappen had fresh tires. It was that the process created an unusually specific situation in which the two title contenders were placed directly together for the final lap. And once that happened, the competitive advantage was enormous. Verstappen had fresh, soft tires. Hamilton had old, hard tires. It didn't take a Formula One strategist to understand the problem. But the other side had an argument too. Red Bull supporters pointed out that Mercedes had made its own strategic decisions throughout the race. Hamilton had opportunities to pit under earlier neutralized conditions, but Mercedes prioritized track position. That choice had worked for most of the race, until it didn't. And that's an important part of the story, because Formula One championships are almost never decided by one isolated decision. They're built from hundreds of choices made across an entire season. Mercedes had dominated large parts of the race. Red Bull had taken the opportunity to put Verstappen on fresh tires. When the safety car changed the circumstances, both teams were forced to react. The difference was that Red Bull had a fresh set of soft tires waiting for Verstappen. Mercedes didn't have the same luxury without giving up the lead. So when people say Abu Dhabi was decided by one radio call, I think that's too simple. The radio call was the emotional climax. It wasn't the beginning of the story, and it certainly wasn't the entire story. There was another important factor: the relationship between team principals and race control. Throughout that era, team principals could communicate directly with the race director during races. That meant Wolff and Red Bull team principal Christian Horner could make their positions known while the most important decisions were being made. Imagine trying to referee an incredibly tense sporting event while the teams involved are simultaneously arguing their cases directly to you. That's the environment Masi was operating in. And after Abu Dhabi, the FIA took a much closer look at that relationship. The investigation concluded that Masi had acted in good faith, but had made what the FIA described as a human error in applying the regulations. That finding was significant because it didn't simply erase what happened. Instead, it acknowledged that the situation had been mishandled, while also recognizing the enormous pressure surrounding the decision. Masi was subsequently removed from his position as race director. The FIA also introduced changes concerning direct communications between team principals and race director, partly because of the pressure that had been placed on race control during critical moments. So, in a strange way, the Abu Dhabi controversy didn't end when Verstappen crossed the finish line. It continued into the structure of Formula One itself, and Mercedes wasn't willing to simply move on that night. The team protested the result before ultimately withdrawing its appeal. Mercedes also did not attend the FIA prize-giving ceremony. That decision showed just how serious the situation had become inside the team. This wasn't simply frustration after losing a championship. The team believed something fundamental had gone wrong. Hamilton had been leading for most of the race. He had been controlling the final stages. And then, within minutes, the circumstances completely changed. For Hamilton supporters, that final lap represented the loss of what could have been an 8th world championship. For Verstappen supporters, however, the outcome represented the culmination of an entire season, in which Verstappen had fought Hamilton race after race. That's why the two interpretations became almost impossible to reconcile. One side looked at the final lap and saw an extraordinary sporting injustice. The other looked at the entire season and saw a championship decided by racing. And somewhere between those two positions is the complicated reality. The race produced an unforgettable sporting moment, but the procedure used to create the final lap restart generated legitimate questions about how the rules were interpreted. That distinction is important because it allows us to discuss Abu Dhabi without reducing everything to a simple good versus bad story. There is another important factor that makes this controversy even more fascinating. The final lap wasn't close for very long. Verstappen's fresh soft tires gave him an enormous advantage. He stayed behind Hamilton initially, waited for his opportunity, and then made the move. Hamilton tried to defend, but with the tire difference and the circumstances of the restart, Verstappen was able to take the lead. And just like that, the 2021 championship was over. One season, 22 races, thousands of kilometers, hundreds of strategic decisions, and it all came down to that final lap. That is why the emotional reaction was so intense. Imagine watching a championship unfold over months and believing the final result is almost settled, only to see the entire competitive picture change within minutes. That's what happened to Mercedes, and that's why the Wolff radio message became so memorable. His voice wasn't polished, it wasn't carefully prepared, it wasn't a press conference statement. It was an immediate reaction from inside the Mercedes garage, and perhaps that's exactly why millions of people remembered it. Formula One is usually presented as a sport of precision. Every tire strategy is calculated, every aerodynamic detail is measured, every lap is analyzed. Teams spend enormous amounts of money trying to eliminate uncertainty. But in Abu Dhabi, uncertainty took over. Human judgment became the central factor. And that is where Formula One collided with its own complexity. Because the sport needs rules, but it also needs officials to interpret those rules in real time. And sometimes those two things come into conflict. That is what made the Abu Dhabi controversy so difficult.
There wasn't an easy solution. If the race had finished behind the safety car, critics would have argued that the championship was denied a proper racing finish. If the race resumed under the standard procedure with the lapped cars cleared, there was a strong possibility that Hamilton would remain champion. Instead, the race was restarted with only the 5 cars separating Hamilton and Verstappen removed from the equation. The result was arguably the most dramatic possible ending. But dramatic doesn't automatically mean correct. And correct doesn't necessarily mean dramatic. That's the tension at the heart of this entire story. I think that is also why the controversy never disappeared. If Verstappen had won comfortably after a completely ordinary restart, the argument would have been different. If Hamilton had won behind the safety car, the argument would have been different. Instead, the decision created a final lap duel between the two championship leaders. It produced one of the most memorable endings Formula One had ever seen. And at exactly the same time, it produced one of the most disputed. That combination is almost impossible to forget. Years later, Toto Wolff has continued to speak about how deeply the experience affected his trust in the system. His comments have remained strong, and he has repeatedly argued that the consequences went far beyond one race. From Wolff's perspective, the issue was not merely that Mercedes lost, it was that the credibility of the championship had been damaged. That is a much bigger accusation, and it explains why the Abu Dhabi story continued long after the celebrations ended. For Red Bull and Verstappen supporters, however, the story looks completely different. They point to Verstappen's season-long performance. They point to the strategic decisions made during the race. They point to the fact that racing under green conditions is what everyone wants whenever circumstances allow it. And they reject the idea that Verstappen's championship should be defined entirely by the final lap. That's fair too. A championship isn't won by one corner.
Verstappen and Hamilton had spent an entire season pushing each other to extraordinary levels. There were victories, setbacks, strategic battles, qualifying fights, and countless moments that had nothing to do with Abu Dhabi. So when people reduce the 2021 championship to the final few minutes, they risk ignoring everything that came before it. But when people ignore the final few minutes completely, they also miss why the controversy became so significant. Both things can be true. The championship was an extraordinary season, and the ending generated serious questions. The most fascinating part, to me, is that the controversy eventually became bigger than the people involved. Toto Wolff became associated with that radio message. Michael Masi became associated with the decision. Hamilton became associated with the championship that slipped away. Verstappen became associated with the title that finally arrived after years of trying. And Formula One became associated with one question that still refuses to disappear. What should matter more when the rules and the spectacle appear to be pulling in different directions? That is the question Abu Dhabi left behind. And there may never be one answer that satisfies everyone, because fans don't watch Formula One for exactly the same reason. Some want pure competition, some love strategy, some care deeply about technical regulations, some want the most exciting possible finish, and many want all of those things at the same time. The problem is that sometimes the sport has to choose. In Abu Dhabi, the decision created a spectacular final lap, but it also created a controversy that lasted years. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from the entire episode. The final lap didn't just decide a championship. It exposed how much power can exist in the hands of a race director during a critical moment. It exposed the tension between teams and officials. It exposed how difficult it can be to apply detailed sporting regulations under extreme time pressure. And it showed just how quickly a sporting decision can become a cultural argument among millions of fans. That is why Toto Wolff's "No, Michael, no" became much more than a radio message. It became a symbol. For one group of fans, it represented the moment Formula One crossed the line. For another group, it represented the frustration of a team that had lost a dramatic battle. And for many neutral fans, it became a reminder that sport is rarely as simple as the final result suggests. I don't think Abu Dhabi 2021 can be understood by listening to one radio message alone. I have to look at the strategy. I have to look at the safety car. I have to look at the tire difference. I have to look at the regulations. I have to look at the communication between the teams and race control. And I have to look at what happened afterward. When I put all those pieces together, the reason the controversy lasted becomes obvious. There was no shortage of emotion, there was no shortage of disagreement, and there was certainly no shortage of consequences. But perhaps the biggest legacy of Abu Dhabi 2021 is this. Formula One learned that sporting decisions don't disappear when the checkered flag flies. They can shape trust. They can influence regulations. They can change how officials operate. And they can become part of the sport's history forever. Toto Wolff's radio call captured one tiny moment inside a much larger story. A team principal watching his driver's championship hopes disappear. A race director making a decision under enormous pressure. A driver waiting behind another driver with dramatically different tires. And millions of fans watching the same final lap while seeing completely different meanings in what they were witnessing. That's why Abu Dhabi 2021 remains so difficult to settle. If I ask whether the race produced one of the most unforgettable finishes in Formula One history, the answer is clearly yes. If I ask whether the procedure surrounding that finish created legitimate questions, the answer is also yes.
And if I ask whether Toto Wolff's radio call became one of the defining sounds of modern Formula One, there is no real argument. It did. The strange thing about history is that sometimes the most memorable moments aren't the ones everyone agrees on. They're the ones that force everyone to choose a side. And Abu Dhabi 2021 did exactly that. For Mercedes supporters, it became a moment they could never simply forget. For Verstappen supporters, it became the night their driver finally captured the World Championship. For Formula One itself, it became a turning point. And for Toto Wolff, that radio message became the sound of a moment when everything seemed to change in just a few seconds. No, Michael, no. 5 words that captured disbelief. 5 words that became instantly recognizable, and 5 words that still bring the entire Abu Dhabi controversy rushing back. Because when I look at that final lap now, I don't just see a championship being decided. I see a sport being forced to confront one of its biggest questions. When the pressure reaches its absolute limit, should Formula One prioritize the strict application of procedure, or should it do everything possible to keep the race moving? Abu Dhabi gave us one answer. The consequences showed that the sport itself wasn't completely satisfied with how that answer was reached. And that is why, years later, people are still talking about it. Not because everyone remembers every lap of the 2021 season, not because everyone agrees on what should have happened, but because for one extraordinary evening in Abu Dhabi, the entire Formula One world was watching the same race. And somehow, millions of people came away believing they had witnessed completely different endings. But here's the thing about fairness in Formula One. It's always been complicated. Some fans argue that Masi made the right call. They say he was trying to create a racing finish instead of ending the season under a safety car. They point out that Verstappen deserved the championship after an incredible season. They say that Hamilton and Mercedes had their chances and couldn't close the deal. Other fans argue that Masi broke the rules. They say he didn't follow the proper procedures for unlapping cars. They say Hamilton was robbed of a historic 8th title. They say the FIA made a decision that favored drama over fairness. And both sides have valid points. That's what makes this controversy so enduring. But here's what everyone agrees on. That radio call in Abu Dhabi changed Formula One forever. It exposed the power dynamics at play. It showed how much influence team principals could wield over race officials. It demonstrated the immense pressure that race directors face in the heat of the moment. And it led to real change. The removal of Masi, the ban on direct radio access, the creation of a more robust race control structure. Wolff's angry words, spoken in the heat of the moment, became the catalyst for a complete overhaul of how Formula One is officiated. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough. The human cost of that moment. Wolff wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. He had just watched his driver, his friend, his colleague lose a championship in the most brutal way imaginable. He had dedicated years to building Mercedes into the dominant force in F1. He had overseen 7 consecutive Constructors' Championships, and in one moment, it all came crashing down. He threw his headphones, he screamed into the radio, he was captured on camera in a state of raw, unfiltered emotion. And then, in the days that followed, he had to face the cameras. He had to answer questions about whether Hamilton would retire. He had to explain why Mercedes was protesting the result. He had to admit that he too had overstepped. That takes a certain kind of character. The ability to be vulnerable in public, the willingness to admit fault, the strength to push for change even when you're the one who benefited from the old system. And whatever you think about Toto Wolff, whether you love him or hate him, whether you think he was right or wrong, you have to respect that. Let me leave you with this. That radio call in Abu Dhabi wasn't just about one race. It wasn't just about one championship. It was about the soul of Formula One. It asked a question that the sport is still trying to answer. Who should have power in F1? The team principals who invest billions, the race directors who enforce the rules, the fans who watch and judge. And it revealed something uncomfortable, that even in a sport governed by strict rules and regulations, human emotion, anger, frustration, desperation will always find a way to break through. No, Michael, no, no. That was so not right. 7 words, 7 syllables, and they changed everything. Formula One will never be the same, and neither will Toto Wolff. So what happens next? The 2022 season brought new regulations, new cars, and a new race director. The radio access ban meant team principals could no longer directly lobby officials during races. And while controversy never fully disappears from F1, the system is now designed to prevent the kind of pressure that led to Abu Dhabi. But the memory remains. Every time a safety car comes out in a championship-deciding race, fans will remember. Every time a team principal speaks to the media, the question lingers. And every time Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen steps into a car, the ghost of Abu Dhabi 2021 is there. Wolff still thinks about it every week. And so do millions of fans around the world. Because that radio call wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point. A moment when the sport looked in the mirror and didn't like what it saw. And then, slowly, painfully, it started to change. That's the legacy of Toto Wolff's controversial radio call in Abu Dhabi. Not just the anger, not just the heartbreak, but the change that followed. And if you ask me, that's exactly what Formula One needed.